All right, good morning or afternoon or evening, whenever it is that you're watching this and listening to this. A lot of people have reached out to me in the last 48 hours asking about my views on the coronavirus, and particularly in the last 24 hours with regards to the governor of California's declaration of essentially a stay-at-home order, asking all Californians to stay at home except for non-essential activities like getting food and so forth. And a lot of people have been asking about what I think about that. And so this is going to be a bit different from the way that I normally teach. I'm going to, of course, offer some ideas and some suggestions, hopefully just some ideas of things that you can look into or some ideas that you can start thinking about on your own. I guess I'm thinking particularly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, of course. Nietzsche writes, "The state, well, what is that? Well, then now open your ears, for I shall speak to you the death of peoples." And he's not, of course, talking about death and literal death here of people, physical death of people, but he's talking about the death of the individual. Essentially, the idea of ourselves giving over more control of ourselves, our personal daily lives, over to the state or to corporations, essentially any sort of a larger entity, and trusting that they're going to provide for us and take care of us. If you recall, Nietzsche is obsessed with this idea of the Übermensch as the archetype of the higher man, of course. And the higher man is the person who he suggests that we all seek to be, somebody who's independent, someone who isn't reliant on others, particularly of the state. Nietzsche does write that he believes in kindness and empathy towards others, but that we shouldn't rely on it. That's something that we should give to people, but that a higher person is a person who's going to stand above and beyond that dependence. I would suggest to you that in the last 48 hours, the last week, but especially the past 48 hours, I keep hearing more and more about this talk about how we need each other and we depend on each other and all of that. And yet at the same time, we have people who are rushing down to the stores and stockpiling, and not even stockpiling, but hoarding certain basic goods, toilet paper, paper towels, things like that. Water, which is not really useful in a situation like this. And then with all of that, when I was at Walmart this past week watching all this kind of go down, I was remembered of H.L. Mencken, who the thinker who wrote that the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. The idea being that the aim of practical politics is to keep people kind of in fear, so that we can be led as the herd, as Nietzsche would refer to it, towards some direction. And I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy here. I'm not saying that this is a manufactured crisis, or I keep hearing these internet rumors about China and Russia ganging up on the United States. And they're interesting and fun to listen to, but in the same way that reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, reading some kind of piece of fiction is interesting and fun, but not particularly useful for the real situation. I don't think that these are that this crisis is manufactured, but as it's been said before, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so I'm alarmed kind of seeing here in the past 24 hours with the governor's declaration, and then of course in the past few days in other states, about how few people are resisting this sort of infringement on civil liberties. What I mean by that is that following September 11th, there's this passage of the Patriot Act, and even the name itself is misleading, but this idea that there's a fear that the conservatives were kind of taking over, and we're going to use this tragedy of the terrorist attacks of September 11th to curb civil liberties. And there's a lot of resistance to that. And yet I fast forward now to 2020, just 19 years later, and I don't see much of a public clamoring at all to maintain our rights. In fact, in social media, there's social pressure being used in ostracization and shame against people who actually want to maintain their own individual liberties and the civil liberties. So things have completely inversed to this point now where we're so used to just giving up our rights and giving up our own personal autonomy and sovereignty that we just don't even think twice when the governor comes on television and says, stay home, restaurants, you must close, and so forth. We're talking about millions of people with real world issues with jobs and mortgages and all of that. And this isn't to downplay the danger that the virus might present, but we have to consider at some point whether the response to the virus is as bad as the virus itself, or even worse, when we look at the long-term consequences of what actions like this are going to bring. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, madness is something, he says, that's rare in individuals, but in groups and in parties and in peoples, and it's the rule. It's not the exception. And when we see the mob responding in the way that it's responding right now, with thunderous applause, if you know the analogy, to curbing these liberties, it's alarming. And I wonder, fast forwarding, what Nietzsche would say if he saw the 21st century today and our willingness to give up these higher man virtues and essentially just to join the herd, and what power the herd wields. For those of you who kind of think that the herd is overreacting, or I don't know, I'm not a virologist, and I've looked at enough to have an opinion about it, but it's not the important thing here. The important thing to keep in mind is that when Nietzsche talks about the death of God in Zarathustra, he understands that it's not a good thing necessarily, because as humans we're programmed to follow and we're hardwired to worship something. And Nietzsche's concern is that when we see the death of God manifest in the Western world, it's going to be replaced by something. And his terror is that it will be replaced by the state. And largely was. We saw that in the 20th century with the communist regimes. We saw this with World Wars I and World War II. And all the conflicts, hundreds of millions of bodies pile up because of a blind obedience that manifests towards the state. Not that it's unique to the 20th century, but it's on steroids to the 20th century for sure. And so Jung, in the Undiscovered Self, I believe it was, he writes that the state takes the place of God, and that state slavery is a form of worship. The state, like the church, demands enthusiasm, self-sacrifice, love, and if religion requires or presupposes a fear of God, then the state takes good care to provide the necessary terror. And we can see that with the state. We can see it with even just kind of social stigma for people who are worried about that kind of thing, and social shaming. But I think there's a lot here that's worth considering, and I have a lot to say about it, but not the venue for it. So I'll be doing some more thinking, hopefully clarify some of the ideas that I presented here, because this is very much kind of off the top of my head and just talking and ranting here. So I'll say some things maybe in the next few days to clarify some of what I've said here, in case it's murky and all that. So in any event, stay safe, be well, and as the Chinese ironically enough said, may you live in interesting times. These are interesting times. So just understand that everything will be okay. It will be. We'll get there. But in the meantime, there's a lot to think about. So I hope to see you all very soon.